Hello and welcome to an update video. Yesterday on the 12th of March, Ableton released a new beta version for their 12.2 release that's upcoming in the future. And if it's like their last 12.1 release, it'll be quite a while until this comes out. But there are quite a few new exciting features in this update, as well as some fixes from the past update as well. And in this video, I'm not going to talk about every single point. I'm just going to talk about the points that really interest me. So let's take a look. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is the new bounce in place feature, which I know a lot of people have wanted for a long time. In the past, I've always just used the freeze option, freeze a track, create a new audio track underneath it, and then just copy that part down and it will essentially bounce that region in place. Like this. But to be fair to Ableton, now it's been implemented, it is a lot faster. So you can do this in a few different ways, but the new feature to Ableton is going on to, for example, a clip like this. You can now right click on the clip and go to bounce to new track. You can see the key command there is Option, Shift, Command, and J, and it'll take that clip, export it out to a new audio file and put it on an audio track underneath. And also it will mute the original clip too, which is very useful. One thing to point out is this process happens before the mixer, but after the effects that you put on the track. So it will apply reverb, distortion, chorus, EQ, all that stuff, and it will render that into the new audio file, but it won't render out the volume from that original track. And you can see that on the new audio track, how it has the same volume as the original track. And it doesn't have to be just one individual region. If we go down to this chopped up sample down here at the bottom, I could select this whole area, right click on one of the clips and do the same thing. And you can see it will export everything out into its own individual audio files. Personally, I think it would have been nice to just have this as one big audio file instead of all these small individual sections. But you can just go into the first clip and extend that out and it will become one audio file. So, maybe there's a good reason to have all of those little gaps in between, but personally, I would have preferred something like that. And the other option that you see on that list there is the bounce track in place. Now, this isn't actually any different to Ableton 12.1. This is just freeze and flatten, but it's been renamed as bounce track in place. And that works a bit differently because when you click on it, it will export the whole track out, but it will also replace the track that you've got, the original track, with that new audio file, as you can see right there. If you wanted to keep the original though, you could just select, say, the whole track and then do bounce to new track instead. Now, one of the only things I've come across that's a slight problem with this is sidechain routing. For example, I use Kickstart 2 for my sidechain compression quite a lot. So you can see on my meld chord track here, I've got Kickstart 2 and it's being sidechained to the drum kit and then to the kick drum at the top there. If something like that is set up in your project and we go up to our sidechain trigger, which is this drum kit here, sometimes I like to add reverb to my drum kit and export that really heavily reverb version out to do some interesting sound design techniques. But if you right click and try to bounce this to a new track, it won't let you because of that sidechain routing. And this is what would happen with freezing as well. When you used to click freeze track, you weren't allowed to do it because of that sidechain routing too. And it does make sense when it comes to freezing because, of course, that one track will now just be one audio file. You can't send individual elements of that drum kit to another sidechain trigger. But when we use it in this bounce to new track way, we're not freezing the whole track. We're just making essentially an audio file version of that individual track. So maybe that's something that could be fixed. Hopefully it will be. And the other thing as well is, of course, you can't do any bouncing in groups, but that was always the case with frozen tracks too. Overall, amazing feature though. Really great addition to Ableton. Let's move on to Raw then, because Raw has had a few extra features added to it. You might also notice how some of the plugins have slightly changed. They've got a new user interface over on the left of each plugin here, where you can see like the MIDI in and the side chain. And when you're using these little dots here will light up, showing you that something is actually happening. And if you want to use the extended view of Raw, you now use this button here, which just has a slightly different icon, and that will bring it up into the lower part of our arrangement view there. And that's across a load of different plugins. And you also now get these 3 little dots in the top right hand corner where you can enable some extra features too. Going back to Raw, it now has an external MIDI input where you can use MIDI information to control the note of the feedback, which is quite a useful feature. You've just got to make sure you have the feedback mode on note over here, and then you would select what track you want the MIDI to come from, and it will change that delay time to fit with the note. But the really interesting thing I wanted to talk about is actually the new filter type in this section over here on the right, because I've not seen this in auto filter, which we're going to come on to in a bit, also has an update. I've not seen it in simpler, and this is the dispersion filter type. You might have seen a plugin very similar to this before called Disperser by Kilohertz. And it's essentially a phase distortion plugin. It will change the phase of certain frequencies relative to other ones. This is it activated in the bottom right here. And again, if you've used that other plugin Disperser before, you'll see it looks very similar in its shape. I want to take a look at it here on my kick drum because this is where I've used it. So let's turn it off to begin with. This is what the kick drum sounded like before. And then after. You can hear it's very, very subtle, the change in this example here. And it's controlled by the frequency up here, and you've also got a resonance control down here too. So if I start to move this frequency around, you can hear it creates that like lasery effect because it's changing the phase, or essentially delaying certain parts of the frequency spectrum more than others. If we bring the resonance up, it's going to make the shape tighter. You can get all sorts of weird effects, but my main reason for using this is just to help add a little bit of extra punch to percussive instruments and basses. If I bring the resonance all the way down, I'm going to slowly bring the frequency up, and I found it's about 2000 hertz or 3000 hertz where you get this nice snap at the front end of the kick. And again before. And it might seem like quite a small feature, this disperser, but Kilohertz Disperser is one of those plugins that a lot of people end up buying for sound design purposes. And just having this more simplified version in Ableton is just really nice. It means you don't have to buy as many plugins, which is always good. The only downside to it really is it doesn't have as much control as the disperser does inside of Kilohertz. Moving on to the next update, which is auto filter, which is quite a nice surprise. Of course, it looks a lot different to the original. In my opinion, it does look a lot nicer, and there's some other visual changes that they've made which are really helpful too. Let's start out though with the different filter types that we have now. Everything down to morph is exactly the same, but you can see now we've got DJ, comb, resampling, notch, and low pass, and a vowel filter at the bottom as well. And the one I'm using at the moment on my drums here is this resampling filter. This is pretty similar to just using Redux inside of Ableton, but the way I've found it sounds really, really nice is just setting the frequency actually to 20,000 hertz. Just very slightly softens that hi-hat that's a little bit too bright, but it also adds a little bit of extra higher frequencies to that snare in the middle. Another one of the new filter types that they've used is this next auto filter to the right, the DJ one. And this is meant to mimic really a DJ mixer where you have a low pass and a high pass together. And when you bring the control to the left, you're going to bring the high frequencies down like a low pass. When you bring it up past that 12 o'clock point, it's going to add a high pass. And it might be quite overlooked, this feature, but I think it's really good for just adding in very subtle changes. If I look in my drum bus, you can see I can just add in these very subtle changes, and if I go above 0, it's a high pass. And if I go below, it's a nice low pass. It means you don't have to have a bunch of different automations in your project. Obviously, you could set a lot of this stuff up with macros, but again, if you're just starting out, it's a really easy to understand, easy to use plugin. Other types we've got our comb filter. And the resonance here will just control the shape of these cuts and these sections in between. When it's on 0, it's a bit more of a subtle sounding comb filter. And as you bring this up, you can hear it sounds a lot more like that flangey feedback comb filter type. And the morph here in the bottom left will switch between a positive comb filter and a negative, like so. We've also got a notch and low pass, and to some producers this may not seem like a very useful filter type to have in here, but as a lot of you might know, if you produce like dubstep, drum and bass and some of the more heavier sound design focused genres, these filter types are incredibly useful to place in big long insert chains with distortion and multiband compression to really get these big growly bass sounds. The great thing about this is that the morph down here will control the notch on the left and the frequency will control both at the top there, kind of similar to the multi filters that you get inside of Serum. And the same really goes for this vowel at the bottom here too, a formant or vowel filter, I guess you'd call it. With different formant types, and then the morph kind of brings up the higher frequencies, it seems. Now, another new feature of the auto filter are the updated circuit types for the drive. They've actually reduced them down to 4, which I think is a really good idea, because most of the time I didn't actually end up using the SMP and the OSC distortion types, but they've now added in this DFM. And from the description, it seems to be based around internal feedback of the distortion. Turn it on here and bring the drive up. Just as a note, by the way, it is limited to only some of the more simple filter types, not some of the more advanced ones that we were looking at before. And bringing up that drive also brings us on to another new feature. They've added in a soft clipper here, which you can activate, and an output volume too, which is very useful because you'd always generally want to turn the output volume down as you bring that drive up. So I'm just going to adjust the output volume here quite a bit. And just to show the difference, this SFV, this state variable filter, by the way, is probably the cleanest of them all. And all of them also have different resonance characteristics too, which you can have a look at on your own. But as you can hear, it does have a nice tone to it. It doesn't get overly bright or distorted as some of the other ones do. Now, one of the other big things that I really want to talk about inside the auto filter here is that they finally added in some visual representation for the modulation that you can do. If you've used auto filter in the past, you'll know that when you turn, for example, the envelope follower up, it's quite hard to tell exactly what it's doing because you can't see the filter move, whereas now we can. We've still got our attack and release controls in here, but we've also got this new additional hold button, and this will just make sure that the envelope finishes the attack stage before moving on to the release stage. When it's turned off, the envelope might not get to the end of the attack phase before hitting that release phase again. So quite a useful feature to have, I guess. It also now works with the LFO too. They've slightly changed the way the LFO works. They've added in a few more shapes up at the top here. And I'm using it on the comb filter on this arpeggiated sound. And I've got it set to this new Wonder LFO shape, which is normally quite smooth, but they've also added in this extra section over here. I've got it set to sample and hold 8th notes. So every 8th note, it's just going to hold wherever the LFO is for that amount of time. And you can see that it's kind of stuttering and jumping around like this. Overall, it is a really nice update to autofilter. It's going to reduce down the number of autofilters or EQs that I have to use. And it's become a lot more accessible using the LFO and the envelope follower now, because you can actually see what it's doing. Now, these new filter circuits, I've not seen them anywhere else in the other plugins. Hopefully that will come at some point in the future into Simpler, and in Drum Sampler would be very handy. And the next interesting thing I want to talk about is actually a MIDI effect. If you are on the beta, you have to download this separately inside Center Code. And it's a MIDI effect, and it's kind of like a chord trigger plugin, similar to the chord MIDI effect that you already get, but it's a lot closer to, say, the ones in like Logic have some of these features where you can pick a style of chord and it will play different chords that fit with each other when you play up the keys on your keyboard. And it's important when you're using this to go into the presets and choose one of the presets from in here. So for example, I'm going to pick the Neo Soul Major. So loads of really interesting jazzy chords that you get. And I'm just playing the white keys on my keyboard here at the moment. You can also click on the key view up here to see what notes are being played. They've got some other features down here in the bottom too, like this tilt, which will shape the velocity of each of the notes. When it's at this negative percentage at the moment, the velocity of the lower notes will be higher. And when you tilt it the other way, the higher notes will have a higher velocity. Or at least that's what I think it's doing. You've also got inverts. You can add inversions to these chords. And we have strum, which is one of those new MIDI transform effects too. The articulate seems to affect that strum. Hard to exactly tell what it does. It's quite a nice plugin, could be quite inspiring if you're a little bit stuck on what chords to use. At the moment, it doesn't seem extremely flexible, but maybe that's how it's been designed, I don't know. And one of the final things that they've added in is a way in which you can use automation with your keyboard, which is something I never thought I'd really need to use. But if you're working on a laptop or a trackpad, I'm guessing this will be quite a bit easier than having to try and move and click at the same time. And to use it, there's quite a few controls that you can see in the release notes. If I click over an automation here and press enter, it's going to select that breakpoint, as you can see. If I press escape, it'll deselect it again. You can see there is a difference between the two. If when I've got this selected, I press delete, it will of course delete that automation. When we've got it selected, I can use my arrow keys now to move the amount up and down. I can also type in numbers straight away and press enter, and it will add that in as a new value too. I can also then use the left and right to shift the points along left and right. And now if I deselect that breakpoint and I use the Alt and left and right arrow keys, I can jump back and forth between my different breakpoints. If when I've got one of these breakpoints selected, I can use the tab key and the shift and tab keys together to move left and right too. Again, there's probably a lot more to it, but from what I can tell, that's like the basic fundamentals of this. Again, I feel like this is a bit more of a niche thing for people that are using, say, a trackpad or find it hard to use automation with the mouse. Well, again, it's an interesting feature. And then finally, there have been some changes within the browser too. You can now add custom icons to each of your places and your different categories inside of the browser on the left-hand side. They've also slightly redesigned the filter system, which to be fair was quite in your face when you first opened it up. Because if I was looking through kick drums, for example, it will say my tags at the bottom, but I can also quickly add extra tags in if I wanted to do that just by clicking on here and typing. And this is how we can open up the filters now with this button in the top right. And you can also open the tag editor from within this button on the right here too. But the more useful thing that I've found is this 3 dots here on the right, where you can now sort all of your samples based on some other modifiers like their place, which has been my most useful one at the moment. Things like date modified, size, type. Place is very useful though, because you can see I'm searching through all of my samples, but I can define it as being in one place. So this here, for example, this 0_beats is my main sample library where I have all of my drum sounds. So I could also do date modified as well if I wanted to see what the most recent kick drum is, for example. Again, it's all quite like minor stuff in the grand scheme of things. You can check out all the new features and the release notes on Ableton's website. The main features for me, the bouncing in place is great. Love the new updated auto filter, as well as that dispersion inside of Raw can be great for sound design. Let me know your favorite features in the comments below, or if I've missed anything out on this update. If you are interested in learning Ableton, or you're interested in converting over to Ableton, then you could try out our Live 12 course in the description below too, or we also offer private online one-to-one sessions too with myself, where we can go through any missing gaps in your Ableton knowledge as well. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.